Welcome to Cafe Stories, where mysteries come to life. Don't forget to like this video and share it with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started. Sherlock Holmes and the Scandal at St. Bartholomew. Chapter 1. A Murder in the Shadows of St. Bartholomew's. I stood in the quiet, dimly lit office of Dr. Harold Bishop, the senior physician of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and felt the oppressive weight of the silence. Holmes was already at work, his eyes scanning every corner of the room, as though he could read the very air around him. The body of Dr. Bishop lay slumped in his chair, his life extinguished by a single, expertly delivered blow. The scene was eerily calm. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that the doctor had been caught off guard. His desk, neatly arranged with papers and medical records, was untouched. The only disruption to the orderliness of the room was the figure of Dr. Bishop himself, slumped forward with his head resting against the edge of his desk, his hands frozen in an unnatural position. Holmes moved slowly around the body, his keen eyes observing every detail. His gaze flicked first to the wound in Dr. Bishop's chest, which had been made with a sharp instrument. A single downward thrust, he noted. The angle of the wound suggested the killer had been above Dr. Bishop, and the precision of the strike implied a level of expertise. The blow came swiftly and decisively, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to me. A knife, no doubt, a sharp one. The assailant had the skill of a surgeon, or perhaps a soldier, someone used to inflicting damage with swift efficiency. I examined the body more closely, noting the absence of any signs of defensive wounds. Do you think he knew his attacker, Holmes? There's no sign of a struggle. Holmes's lips curled slightly as he crouched down by the desk, his eyes darting over the papers scattered there. Indeed, it's almost as if he was caught unawares, or perhaps trusted the person enough to lower his guard. The lack of defensive wounds suggests a momentary surprise, a fatal underestimation of the assailant's intentions. As Holmes continued his inspection, I began to examine the desk itself. The papers were, as Holmes had said, perfectly arranged. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. However, as I reached for the drawer to examine its contents, I noticed something peculiar beneath the desk. It was a small piece of paper, partially hidden in the shadow of the chair. Blood stained the edges, and the ink was smudged in places. "Holmes," I said, retrieving the note and holding it up for his inspection. "What do you make of this?" Holmes stood up immediately, his eyes narrowing as he studied the bloodied paper in my hand. He didn't need to touch it to know the gravity of what I had found. He took the note from me with a measured hand and read it aloud, his voice tinged with the faintest hint of unease. "The streets will run with what was spilled, a price to pay for those you killed. The scales of justice, tip by hand, now face the fate this night has planned." He read it once more, his brow furrowing as his mind quickly began to weave connections between the words and the circumstances of the murder. "A cryptic warning," Holmes said softly. "It seems our victim was not just a random target. This message, it's deliberate. It is meant for someone. And this is only the beginning." I watched as Holmes turned the note over, studying every inch of it. It was clear that he was deep in thought, connecting the strange poem to the crime scene around him. His eyes flashed with understanding. "The scales of justice," he murmured, tapping the edge of the note. "This suggests a deeper motive, something more than a simple murder. It hints at revenge or perhaps judgment. Whoever left this behind is clearly not finished, Watson. They are sending a message." I stood silently, allowing Holmes to work through the implications in his mind. I knew well enough that when Holmes became absorbed in his thoughts, there was little to be done but wait for the conclusions to come to him. After a long moment, he straightened and returned his focus to the body. His gaze swept the room again as though searching for something that had been overlooked. He looked at the chair where Dr. Bishop had been sitting, then at the desk, and finally at the window. I noticed his eyes linger on the latter for a moment longer than usual, and I followed his line of sight. Dr. Bishop's office overlooks the rear courtyard, Holmes said, his voice suddenly sharp. There is a narrow alley behind the building. It would have been possible for the assailant to enter from that direction, though the absence of footprints suggests they left through the front. He turned to me, his gaze penetrating. We must visit the alley. There is something I suspect we might uncover there. We left the office without further comment, making our way through the sterile halls of St. Bartholomew's. The corridors were unusually quiet, a sharp contrast to the frantic energy that often filled them. As we moved toward the rear of the hospital, I felt a sense of unease growing. There was something about the atmosphere, a heaviness that I could not explain, as though the walls themselves were complicit in hiding the truth. Holmes was already at the door leading to the courtyard. He paused for a moment, scanning the area with his usual methodical precision before stepping out into the dim light. The alley was narrow and confined, its cobblestone surface slick with recent rain. Holmes crouched low, his fingers brushing over the stones as he moved silently, examining the ground with the scrutiny of a man who could deduce a great deal from even the smallest fragment of evidence. Here, he said, rising to his feet and pointing to a faint set of prints in the mud. These are not the prints of a doctor, Watson. They are too deliberate, too practiced. Whoever came this way knew how to move quietly, how to leave no trace. I bent down to examine the prints closely, noting their irregular shape. Could they belong to Dr. Bishop's killer? Holmes shook his head, his expression grim. I believe they belong to someone else, Watson, someone who was present before the murder occurred. I felt a chill pass through me. There was something more at play here than we had yet realized. The prints led us deeper into the alley, but Holmes's attention was already shifting. He had seen enough to confirm his suspicions, but he wasn't ready to reveal them just yet. We'll return to Baker Street, Watson, Holmes said, standing and brushing the dirt from his trousers. There is much more to this case than we can yet see. And this note, he added, holding the blood-stained piece of paper once more, is only the beginning. As we made our way back through the fog-choked streets of London, I could not help but feel a sense of foreboding settling over me. The case had begun in the usual manner, mysterious, unsettling, with Holmes already several steps ahead of everyone else. But there was something different this time, something darker. By the time we arrived at Baker Street, I knew that the investigation was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Telegram and the Web of Shadows. The following morning, the case still weighed heavily on my mind. As I sat in the small sitting room, my thoughts revolved around the blood-stained note we had discovered the previous day. The cryptic warning it contained had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, its words echoing ominously in my thoughts. What manner of person would leave such a message behind? And why? Holmes, of course, had already begun his own contemplations, and I knew from experience that when his mind turned towards a case, little could interrupt his focus. I had barely finished a breakfast of toast and tea when Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, carrying a telegram on a small silver tray. Her face, as usual, bore a mixture of curiosity and mild concern. "For you, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice pitched low, as though she sensed something untoward was afoot. The messenger seemed in quite a hurry. I took the telegram from her, noticing immediately that its edges were stained with what appeared to be dried blood. A curious detail. Telegrams were not typically delivered with such markings unless something most unusual was afoot. Holmes, who had been deep in thought at the table, raised an eyebrow as I unfolded the message. "Who sent this?" I asked, my voice edged with suspicion. Mrs. Hudson, who had always been observant, shook her head. "I couldn't say, sir. The messenger was gone before I could inquire." Holmes, now leaning forward in his chair, fixed his intense gaze upon the telegram as I read the message aloud. "The game begins. A clue I leave, a tangled web for you to weave." The telegram was unsigned, its contents terse and unsettling. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I read it a second time. "A clue, Holmes, another riddle. It seems our adversary is intent on drawing us into their web." Holmes nodded but said nothing. His gaze focused on the telegram. He had always been quick to make connections, and I knew that the silence meant he was already at work unraveling the mystery. "We must find out who wrote this," I added, perhaps more to myself than to Holmes. "The blood on the edges is most telling. The message was delivered with deliberate intent." Holmes, who had remained unusually quiet, suddenly stood up and began pacing across the room. His eyes flickered from the telegram to the nearby window, as if some hidden clue in the room might reveal itself to him. "It is no mere coincidence, Watson," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "The blood, the cryptic words, and now this. It is as if we are being drawn into a game whose rules are yet unclear, but whose consequences are already beginning to take shape." "Do you think this is connected to the murder?" I asked, my mind racing through possible scenarios. Holmes stopped pacing and fixed me with a sharp look. "Of course. Whoever killed Dr. Bishop did not do so simply to end his life. No, Watson. This is part of something much larger, something intricate. A plan that has been set in motion long before we arrived." His words sent a tremor of unease through me. I had seen Holmes unravel complex cases before, but this one felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something much darker was unfolding before us. As the morning wore on, we began our usual process of investigation, though there was a palpable sense of frustration in the air. The telegram had, as Holmes had predicted, been delivered with deliberate purpose, but we were no closer to understanding the sender's intentions. Holmes made inquiries with Mrs. Hudson regarding the messenger, but as she had said, no one had seen him. The case seemed to slip further into the realm of shadow and uncertainty. After a few hours of fruitless effort, Holmes turned to me, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Watson, I believe our adversary is watching us. They know our every move and they are enjoying this game. But why? What are they trying to accomplish?" I had no answer. I could only watch as Holmes's mind worked feverishly, piecing together the few facts we had before us. His ability to connect disparate pieces of information was unmatched, and I had no doubt that he would find the answer, though it seemed tantalizingly out of reach. As the day dragged on, a further complication arose. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a knock sounded at the door, and we were presented with yet another unsettling item, a small parcel, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. Mrs. Hudson, ever the dutiful landlady, handed it over to us with a concerned look. "It was left just outside the door, Doctor. No one was in sight when I went to fetch it." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest as he accepted the parcel, carefully untying the ribbon. His hands moved with methodical precision, his attention entirely focused on the task at hand. As the paper fell away, the contents were revealed. A blood-stained ribbon, likely belonging to one of the kidnapped children, and a small, folded note. "The ribbon, Watson?" Holmes said, his voice tense. "This is a symbol. The same person who wrote the telegram is responsible for this as well." I took the note from Holmes's hand and read aloud, my heart sinking with each word. "Through shadows deep your trail I tread, while debts are paid in shades of red." The tone was chillingly similar to the message we had received in the telegram. The imagery was consistent: shadows, debts, blood. It was clear that the writer of these notes was deliberately playing with us, twisting the knife in a game that was becoming all too real. "This," Holmes said, his voice tinged with frustration, "is not just a warning, Watson. It is a taunt, a deliberate provocation meant to throw us off balance." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words. "But what is their endgame, Holmes? What are they trying to achieve?" Holmes, deep in thought, stood for a moment staring at the note as though it might reveal its secrets. Finally he looked up, his eyes sharp and filled with resolve. "We must continue to investigate, Watson, but remember this: our adversary is no ordinary criminal. They are a master of manipulation, using these notes and riddles to pull us into their twisted game. We must be cautious, for we are dealing with a mind that is not only clever, but also dangerous." I could not help but agree. The case had taken on a sinister new dimension. We were no longer simply investigating a murder. We were caught in a web of intrigue, a puzzle whose pieces were being fed to us in drips and drabs. And with each passing moment, the stakes grew higher. Holmes turned to me, his voice calm yet laced with determination. "We must not allow ourselves to be outwitted. I sense that this is only the beginning, Watson. Whatever is to come, we will face it together." As we sat in the gloom of our Baker Street apartment, the fog of London creeping in through the windows, I knew that this case would test Holmes and me in ways we could scarcely imagine. We were caught in a web of shadows, and I could not shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 3: The Kidnappings and the Silent Trail. London, in September of 1887, had grown darker and more uncertain with each passing day. The fogs that seemed to envelop the city's streets were more than just a mere meteorological phenomenon. They were the physical manifestation of the malaise that had begun to settle over us. The murder of Dr. Harold Bishop had not only shattered the calm of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, but it had also set into motion a series of events that seemed to grow more complex with every new discovery. It had been less than a week since the cryptic telegram had arrived at 221B Baker Street, yet the case had already taken a troubling turn. We had barely begun to digest the implications of the message when new horrors emerged. A series of kidnappings had rocked the city, all involving the children of prominent doctors, and the connection to Dr. Bishop's murder became all too apparent. It was early afternoon when Holmes and I received the latest report. An urgent knock at the door heralded the arrival of a messenger from Scotland Yard. He handed Holmes a folder containing the grim news. Several children had disappeared in recent days. All were the offspring of doctors affiliated with St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Their parents, as one might expect, were beside themselves with terror, and the police had been unable to make any headway in their investigations. Holmes wasted no time in perusing the details of the cases. His eyes flicked over the list of names, each one corresponding to a child now missing, while I stood by watching as his mind worked through the connections. "It is not mere coincidence, Watson," Holmes remarked, his voice low and thoughtful. "These kidnappings are not random. They are linked not only by the profession of the parents, but by something deeper, something hidden." I peered over his shoulder, though I had little hope of seeing what Holmes had already discerned. "But why? What motive could there be in abducting children? Holmes turned to face me, his eyes alight with the fire of his deductions. The question is not why, Watson. It is why now. The timing is deliberate. The fact that these children are taken rather than their parents suggests a purpose, a plan. We are dealing with an adversary who is far more calculating than any ordinary criminal. But the danger to the children, I began, but Holmes held up a hand. They are pawns, Watson, mere pawns, and the true target is something much larger. I nodded, still unable to fully grasp the depth of the situation, but knowing enough to trust Holmes's instinct. He had already deduced that these kidnappings were not acts of senseless violence, but part of a larger, more complex scheme. Our adversary had carefully chosen these children, perhaps to send a message, or perhaps to manipulate the emotions of their parents. We set off immediately for St. Bartholomew's, where the staff were in a state of near panic. Word had spread like wildfire throughout the hospital, and the doctors were terrified, not only for their children, but for their own safety. It was a scene of confusion and distress when we arrived, and the presence of Scotland Yard officers only heightened the sense of unease that seemed to pervade the halls. Holmes, ever calm and composed, made his way through the corridors with his usual deliberate stride, stopping only to speak with a few of the doctors. I remained close by, following his lead, though I could sense the growing tension in the air. Every conversation seemed to circle back to one thing: the disappearance of the children. As we reached the offices of the missing doctors, Holmes asked to examine their homes. It was there, amid the homes of the abducted, that our investigation would take an unexpected turn. The first house we visited was that of Dr. John Hammond, a well-regarded surgeon who had recently lost his young daughter, Lucy. Dr. Hammond's wife, a fragile-looking woman with pale features, greeted us at the door. She was distraught, her face marked by sleepless nights, and the deep concern of a mother who had seen the world, she knew, crumble. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice shaking. It was all so quiet. She was playing in her room, and then she was gone. Holmes nodded sympathetically but said little. He was, as ever, focused on the facts, and he moved with a precision that I knew meant he was already observing everything around him. We were shown into Lucy's room, which, though modest, was neatly kept. Holmes's eyes roamed the space, scanning for any clues that might reveal a hint of the perpetrator's presence. His keen gaze shifted from the walls to the windowsill and the furniture, each detail contributing to the growing pattern in his mind. "There are faint footprints here," he said suddenly, crouching down by the window, "outside the room just beneath the sill, and they are smaller, likely belonging to a woman." I stepped forward, kneeling beside Holmes as I inspected the prints. They were indeed faint, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but Holmes's attention to detail had uncovered them with ease. "What do you make of it?" I asked, though I had no idea what he could possibly deduce from such small impressions. Holmes stood and straightened his coat. "This confirms my suspicions. The abductions are methodical, precise, and more importantly, they involve no violence. It is as if the children are being taken without their even knowing what is happening. But why?" I asked again, the same question echoing in my mind. Holmes did not answer immediately, for he was already deep in thought, piecing together what little information we had. After a few moments he turned to me, his expression grave. "I believe we are looking at something very carefully orchestrated, Watson. The perpetrator is not interested in harming the children. Rather, they seek to terrify their parents. These doctors, all of them men of repute, must have some skeletons in their closets, some hidden guilt that our adversary intends to make them face." I felt a sense of unease settle over me. If Holmes was correct, and I had no reason to doubt him, then these kidnappings were part of a larger scheme of retribution. The children were not the targets, but the means by which their parents would be forced to reckon with something from their past. "We must continue, Watson," Holmes said, his voice resolute. "There is more to this than we yet know." Our next stop was Dr. Hammond's colleague, Dr. George Richmond, whose son, William, had also vanished in the night. The house was similarly silent and grim, though there were no further clues like the footprints we had found at Hammond's. The absence of any visible evidence was troubling, but Holmes, unperturbed, seemed to find something that eluded my eye. After several more hours of searching the homes of the remaining kidnapped children, we found little more than the same: the absence of violence, the quiet precision of the abductions, and the faintest suggestion that someone or something was controlling the situation from the shadows. Holmes's thoughts were as deep and labyrinthine as the case itself, and he seemed no closer to the solution than he had been when we first began. As we walked back to Baker Street, the weight of the case hung heavily upon us. The threads of the investigation were now clear, but they were tangled and elusive. We were being led down a path, but by whom, and for what purpose? Holmes broke the silence as we neared our familiar doorstep. "We are dealing with a mind that is as calculating as it is cold, Watson," he said, his voice unwavering. "But I have learned enough to know that this is not the work of a mere madman. There is something personal, something deeply rooted in the past that drives these actions. We must uncover it, for only then will we truly understand the mind we face." The door opened, and we stepped into the gloom of Baker Street, the fog of the city swirling outside. The game had begun, and we were no longer simply observers. We were participants in a darker, more dangerous game than I could have imagined. Chapter 4. Whispers from the Past. The search for answers had led us once more to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, but this time we were not here to investigate the side of a crime. Rather, we found ourselves in the midst of a growing storm of suspicion and fear. The abductions continued to haunt the city, leaving in their wake a growing sense of unease. It seemed that every new disappearance only served to raise the stakes, and the shadow of Dr. Bishop's murder loomed larger with each passing day. Holmes, however, had a particular tenacity when it came to pursuing the hidden motives behind these grim events. Despite the growing tension surrounding the kidnappings, he insisted that we focus on uncovering the truth of Dr. Harold Bishop's death. I had thought, perhaps mistakenly, that we might shift our attention to the children who had vanished, but Holmes remained determined, even fixated, on the link between the murder and the secrets hidden within the walls of the hospital. As we stood in Dr. Bishop's study that morning, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. The sterile, clinical environment, which had once seemed like a haven of order and discipline, now felt oppressive, as though it were harboring a terrible secret. Holmes was silent, his eyes sweeping over the desk, the cabinets, the carefully arranged bookshelves, as if he could discern every nuance that might escape the average observer. "What do you make of it, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice low, almost as if he was speaking to himself. I cast a careful eye over the room. The desk was in order, but there was something about it that felt off, slightly askew. The faintest disarray on the surface of the papers suggested someone had been hurriedly searching through them, though everything seemed in place at a quick glance. "Nothing unusual, Holmes," I replied. "The desk has been disturbed, certainly, but not in a way that might lead to any significant clue. It seems rather like a casual search." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his fingers brushing the edge of the drawer. "Perhaps," he said, "but this was not the sort of search one might expect from a professional. Whoever did this was in a hurry, and yet they were careful to leave nothing more than the faintest trace of their presence." There is something deliberate about it. I watched him closely as he pulled open the drawer and began rifling through the contents with practiced efficiency. He withdrew a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn with age and use. Holmes's eyes flickered over it, and for a moment I thought he might begin reading it immediately. Instead, he glanced at me and then back at the journal, a brief pause in his usually rapid thought process. "This," he said, holding it up to the light, "is an interesting piece. I shall take it with me for later examination." I nodded, though I had little idea of what significance this journal might hold. Holmes was already placing it carefully into his bag, and as he did I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of foreboding. It was clear that he suspected there was more to this than met the eye, but what it might be was still unclear. We moved quickly through the rest of the investigation, though each step forward seemed to lead us deeper into a labyrinth of contradictions. "Let us return to Baker Street," Holmes said, finally closing the study door behind us. "I believe we have sufficient material for today." I followed him out of the hospital and into the quiet streets of London. The air had turned sharp, carrying with it a breeze that stirred the lingering fog in the corners of the city. We walked in silence, each of us lost in our own thought. I couldn't help but be troubled by the knowledge that our adversary seemed to be so many steps ahead of us. Whoever was behind these kidnappings and the murder of Dr. Bishop was playing a game far beyond our comprehension, and I found myself growing more concerned with each passing hour. Holmes, however, seemed undeterred. His mind was already moving forward, constantly weaving together the various threads of the case. His pace quickened as we neared Baker Street, and I found myself unable to keep up with his thoughts, which were no doubt already darting to the next point of inquiry. I, on the other hand, could only marvel at the way his mind worked, how it seemed to leap from one conclusion to another with a surety that was sometimes unsettling. As we reached the familiar door of 221B, Holmes turned to me and smiled. "We shall begin again tomorrow, Watson, but for now we must be patient. The puzzle is a complex one, and the pieces will fall into place when the time is right." Once inside, Holmes immediately set about reviewing the notes he had taken during the day's investigation, his gaze flitting from one detail to another with almost dizzying speed. I, meanwhile, sat down at my desk and began to sift through my own thoughts. My mind kept returning to the mysterious journal that Holmes had taken from Dr. Bishop's study. I had seen its contents briefly, but I could not say what significance it held. Holmes had seemed interested, but I had learned long ago that he often carried out his investigations in his own time and in his own way. I resolved to examine it later, but as the evening wore on and the ticking of the clock filled the silence, I found myself distracted by other matters. Holmes, too, had seemingly forgotten about the journal, his attention absorbed in a series of telegrams that had arrived during the day. The cryptic messages, each more baffling than the last, seemed to plague him as he scoured them for any potential lead. It was only then that I realized that in the rush of our investigation, the journal had slipped from both our minds. The hours passed quickly, and by the time the evening light began to fade, I could feel the weight of the case bearing down on me. Holmes had not once mentioned the journal again, and I was left to wonder whether it had indeed been as significant as he had first suggested. Yet, even as I questioned its importance, I knew that Holmes would not leave it unexamined for long. For now, however, it was a mystery that remained untouched, left to sit, as so many things did in Holmes's world, on the edge of our attention, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true value. Chapter 5. The Unopened Journal. The days following our return from St. Bartholomew's Hospital seemed to stretch endlessly before us. The sinister pattern of the kidnappings continued to haunt London, and the shock of Dr. Bishop's murder had begun to fade, replaced by growing anxiety over the fate of the missing children. Holmes, as ever, was driven by the desire to piece together the puzzle, though he refused to speak of it openly. He spent long hours at Baker Street, hunched over his desk, scouring papers, telegrams and news reports for any clue that might shed light on the perpetrator's identity. I, for my part, found myself consumed by an unease that I could not shake. My mind kept returning to the leather-bound journal that Holmes had taken from Dr. Bishop's office, an object that, despite its obvious significance, had been almost entirely forgotten. Holmes had not spoken of it again since that day, and I began to wonder if it had indeed been as important as I had first imagined. The journal, which had once seemed so innocuous, now loomed larger in my thoughts. I had learned long ago that Holmes often worked in ways that defied expectation, allowing pieces of evidence to settle in the background until their moment came. This journal, it seemed, was destined for such a moment. One evening, as the gas lamps flickered in the darkening streets of London, Holmes finally turned his attention to the journal. He had been pacing restlessly around the room, as he often did when deep in thought, when his eyes fell upon the small leather book sitting inconspicuously on his desk. With a sharp intake of breath, he crossed the room and sat down. His fingers brushed over the cover, and for the briefest instant I saw a flicker of anticipation in his usually impassive face. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "this journal may prove to be more than we have given it credit for. I suspect it holds answers we have been blind to up until now." I did not interrupt him as he carefully opened the journal, his eyes scanning the pages with practiced ease. The handwriting was neat but hurried, and as Holmes flipped through the pages, I could see that the entries were sporadic, seemingly disconnected, as if the writer had been overwhelmed by events and had recorded them in fits and starts. Holmes paused at a particular entry, his finger tracing the words. "Here it is," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It is just as I thought." I leaned in, though I could not make sense of the cryptic lines. Holmes continued to read aloud, his eyes never leaving the page. "The inquiry must remain secret. There are too many who stand to lose. The death of Thomas Wilkes cannot be tied to the actions of the hospital staff. We will bury it deep." I felt a chill pass through me. The name Thomas Wilkes was one that had not entered our investigation up until this point, and yet in Holmes's manner I saw that it was significant. His mind had already connected the dots, and I could see the cogs turning rapidly in his head as he processed the information. "This," he said slowly, "is the secret inquiry from 1879. The death of a child, Thomas Wilkes, a death that was never meant to be uncovered." His voice had taken on a darker tone. "And yet here it is, hidden in the pages of this journal, a cover-up." I sat back in my chair, momentarily struck silent by the implications of what he was saying. Holmes was right. The journal, which had seemed an afterthought, now appeared to hold the key to the mystery we had been pursuing. The death of a child, an event so tragic that those involved had gone to great lengths to conceal it, was connected to the murder of Dr. Bishop and by extension to the ongoing kidnappings. Holmes closed the journal carefully, his eyes fixed on the desk as he contemplated the newfound information. "The truth is buried in this hospital's past, Watson. Those responsible for the death of young Thomas Wilkes thought they could escape the consequences of their actions, but as we have seen, the past has a way of resurfacing. And those who have been involved in this cover-up are not free from the consequences of their sins." I felt a growing unease in my chest as I watched Holmes. His words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much injustice, someone who was determined to right wrongs that others would rather forget. It was clear to me now that Dr. Bishop's murder was no isolated act. It was part of something larger, something far more sinister that had been brewing for years. And the kidnapping of the children, their fate, it seemed, was intertwined with the secrets buried within the walls of St. Bartholomew's. Holmes stood up and paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. The inquiry into Thomas Wilkes's death, he mused aloud, was not merely an attempt to protect the reputation of a hospital. It was a deliberate attempt to cover up something far darker. The hospital's senior staff were implicated in the boy's death, and now it seems those same people are involved in the current string of crimes. Dr. Bishop was but one link in a chain that stretches far deeper than we anticipated. I could hardly keep up with the rapidity of Holmes's deductions. But I understood the gravity of what he was saying. The death of Thomas Wilkes had been an incident that had sent ripples through the hospital's community, and those ripples had continued to spread, distorting everything they touched. Holmes's eyes flashed as he turned toward me, a glint of resolve in his gaze. "This is no longer a simple case of murder and kidnapping, Watson. It is a case of vengeance, of justice sought through violent means, and I believe the person behind these acts is someone who has been waiting for years, biding their time, and now they are striking back." The silence that followed his words was heavy with meaning, and I could not help but feel that we were on the cusp of something momentous. The murder of Dr. Bishop, the disappearance of the children, it was all part of a larger plan, one that we had only begun to understand. The hospital's dark past had given birth to the current horrors, and it was only a matter of time before those responsible would have to face the consequences. Holmes replaced the journal in his bag with a sharp movement, his mind already moving toward the next step. "We must proceed carefully, Watson. These people will stop at nothing to protect their secrets, but they are not the only ones with power. We shall see who will outlast the other." As I watched Holmes, I realized that we were no longer chasing mere clues. We were engaged in a battle for the truth itself, and it was a battle whose outcome would determine not just the fates of the missing children, but the very soul of the hospital that had allowed such horrors to unfold. Chapter 6. The Shadow of Judgment. "It is time we go to Dr. Grayson's house," Holmes said suddenly, his voice low but resolute. I looked at him in surprise. Of all the individuals involved in the murky affair at St. Bartholomew's, Dr. Grayson had not yet come into the frame, yet Holmes had always been a step ahead of me. "Dr. Grayson?" I asked. "I discovered his involvement in the journal, Watson," Holmes continued, his voice steady as he turned to face me. "Dr. Grayson was complicit from the start, one of the key players in the cover-up. But we haven't yet investigated him, Holmes. Are you certain he is involved?" Holmes glanced at me sharply, his eyes alight with the kind of cold certainty that only he could possess. "Not only is Dr. Grayson involved, Watson, but he is the key to understanding the next move in our case. He is one of the senior surgeons at St. Bartholomew's, highly regarded and deeply entrenched in the hospital's most secretive dealings. If anyone has information, it is he." I nodded, my thoughts spinning as I followed Holmes into the gloom of the evening. Dr. Grayson, a respected figure within the hospital, had never appeared as a suspect until now. Still, Holmes's instinct rarely faltered, and I knew that if he said the man was important, it was because something vital had pointed him in Grayson's direction. We made our way through the winding London streets, the mist swirling around us as we walked toward Dr. Grayson's home. The closer we drew, the more the uneasy tension in my chest grew. It was as though we were approaching an inevitable reckoning, like walking toward the edge of some precipice that we could neither avoid nor fully comprehend. Dr. Grayson's house was a grand but weathered building tucked between two other smaller residences. Holmes approached the front door without hesitation, his hand reaching for the brass knocker. A quick rap echoed through the stillness, breaking the silence that had descended upon us. A moment passed, and there was no answer. Holmes's brow furrowed, and he stepped aside, allowing me to take a glance through the small gap in the curtains at the window next to the door. The house was dark inside, no flicker of light indicating anyone's presence. Something about the silence of the place felt off. "No answer?" I asked. "No answer," Holmes replied, his lips curling into the faintest of frowns. "The doctor is not at home, or he is deliberately hiding." We waited a few moments longer, and I was about to suggest that we attempt a search of the property when Holmes turned on his heel, already moving toward the side of the house. "There is another way in," he murmured, more to himself than to me, and I followed him, puzzled but intrigued. Holmes approached a small, ivy-clad window on the side of the building, seemingly unbothered by the fact that we were moving from the front door to the back with such urgency. He crouched, inspecting the window closely, and within moments his hand was at work on the latch. I heard the soft click of metal, and with a look of quiet satisfaction, Holmes gently pushed the window open. "After you, Watson," he said, his eyes gleaming with a quiet triumph. I glanced at him with some hesitance, but obeyed. We climbed in swiftly, the room smelling of stale air and untouched wood. It was a study, much like Dr. Bishop's, with bookshelves laden with medical texts and papers scattered over the desk. But there was an ominous stillness to the room, a sense that we were intruding upon something that was meant to remain hidden. Holmes was already at the desk, his eyes scanning the contents. He flipped through the papers quickly, his fingers moving with a practiced efficiency, though his brow remained furrowed in concentration. I stood back, watching him carefully, when suddenly he paused. I moved to his side, and we both peered down at what he had uncovered. A series of letters, half opened, on top of a particularly battered journal. One letter in particular caught Holmes's attention. He read it aloud, his voice low and steady. "You have played your part, and now the reckoning comes. We will finish this at the chapel. Come alone if you wish to save what remains of your soul." The words sent a chill down my spine. It was clear that whoever had written this knew far too much. "Holmes, what does this mean? Is Dr. Grayson involved in all this?" "I believe," Holmes replied, slowly, his tone grave, "that Dr. Grayson is at the center of it all. But we are too late to stop him from carrying out his role in this grim tale." His voice had dropped to a near whisper as he continued to search through the desk drawers. With a sudden motion, Holmes pulled open a hidden compartment at the bottom. His fingers brushed against something soft, and he withdrew what appeared to be a small address book, though it was, to all intents and purposes, a record of carefully kept names and locations. I leaned in for a closer look. "Holmes, do you think Grayson is part of this elaborate scheme?" "I do," Holmes said quietly. "I believe he is no victim. He is working with the killer, perhaps in more ways than we yet understand. The note and the letter, found here, suggest he is orchestrating something, a final piece, in the puzzle we have yet to complete." The implications of what Holmes was saying began to sink in, and a sense of foreboding gripped me. We had believed Dr. Grayson to be innocent, a mere doctor caught in the web of a tragedy. But now, it seemed, he was one of the key players in a game far more complex than we had anticipated. Holmes's eyes flicked to the final line of the letter. "The chapel," he murmured. "It is there that we must go next, Watson. The killer wants us to follow, and we shall." I stood, hesitant, but trusting in Holmes's instincts. The room had grown cold, the words on the paper seeming to echo in the stillness. It was clear now that the killer had intended to lead us to this very place, Dr. Grayson's home, where the truth had been hidden under layers of deception. "Come, Watson," Holmes said, slipping the letter into his coat pocket. "We are not yet finished here, but we will finish this tonight." We exited the house swiftly, the weight of the letter pressing on my mind. The trap had been set. The next move, as Holmes had so precisely calculated, was ours to make. I glanced back at the house, a final, lingering sense of unease gnawing at me. In that quiet house, something dark and unspoken was unfolding, and we were on the cusp of discovering it. We turned toward the chapel, the silence of the night growing thicker, and I could not help but wonder what awaited us there, what truth lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. Chapter 7. The Chapel of Shadows. It was an hour before midnight when Holmes and I arrived at the chapel. The streets of London were quieter than usual, and a heavy silence seemed to settle over the city, as if it too was holding its breath. My heart pounded in my chest as we approached the doors of the old chapel, its stone exterior worn and grey in the pale light of the gas lamps. Holmes's stride was purposeful as he led the way, his eyes sharp and alert, as though expecting danger at every turn. I had seen him in many a pursuit, but tonight there was something different, something darker in his bearing. The game, it seemed, had reached its bitter conclusion. As we entered the chapel, the air grew colder, the scent of old wood and incense mingling with the sharp tang of something more sinister. The silence inside was overwhelming, broken only by the soft echo of our footsteps on the stone floor. My eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom, but the faint glow of candlelight illuminated the narrow passage leading to a side chamber at the rear. Holmes moved swiftly, his long coat sweeping behind him as he approached the door. It was locked, but a single glance at it was enough for him to make the decision. He grasped the handle with ease and, after a moment of silence, turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a sight that made my stomach drop. The children, those poor, innocent children, were huddled together in a corner of the room, wide-eyed and trembling. There were no signs of physical harm, but their fear was palpable. They had been trapped here, locked away like prisoners, and yet, miraculously, they were unharmed. "Holmes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The children." Holmes nodded grimly. "They are unharmed, Watson, but we must make haste. They are not the only ones here." As if on cue, a soft rustle broke the silence, and from the shadows emerged a figure. Clara Wilkes, the mother of the child whose death had set this entire tragedy into motion. She stood in the center of the room, her eyes cold and unyielding. In her hand she gripped a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. At her side stood Dr. Grayson, his face a mask of composed indifference. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The killer, nay, the orchestrator, had been hiding in plain sight all along. "You've come, Sherlock Holmes," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion, but underlaid with something darker. She raised the knife, the handle gripped in both hands as though she were prepared to strike at any moment. "I suppose you've come to stop me?" Holmes's eyes narrowed, his expression unchanging. "Not to stop you, Mrs. Wilkes, but to understand you. To understand why you've done this." Clara's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Understand me? You think you can understand vengeance, Mr. Holmes? You think you can comprehend the weight of a mother's grief?" Grayson, standing behind her, shifted slightly, his hands clasped before him in a posture of quiet resignation. His face was pale, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. It was clear that he had been complicit in everything that had transpired, but now the final reckoning was upon him. Holmes stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "You've taken a terrible path, Mrs. Wilkes. What you've done, the children you've abducted, the lives you've destroyed, it's all a result of a twisted sense of justice, one that has lost its way." "You don't understand, Holmes," Clara cried, her grip tightening on the knife. "The doctors at St. Bartholomew's killed my son. They murdered him and they covered it up. They ruined my life, my family. They deserve to suffer, and I will make them pay, every last one of them." Holmes shook his head. "Your son died, Mrs. Wilkes, but your quest for vengeance has become an obsession that has led you to hurt others, the innocent children, the doctors. You've all but destroyed yourself in the process." Clara's face contorted with rage. "Destroyed myself? I have nothing left, Sherlock Holmes, nothing but the desire to see justice done. Those men at the hospital, they knew what happened to Thomas. They buried it, all of it. Dr. Grayson, my own flesh and blood, he helped me. Together we've made them pay." Dr. Grayson, whose silence had been unnerving, finally spoke, his voice laced with a quiet bitterness. "I helped her, yes. I did what was necessary. I was tired of seeing others take the glory, the recognition, while I was relegated to the shadows. The others, Bishop, the others, they didn't deserve their success. And so I helped her, to make them suffer." I could scarcely believe my ears. Dr. Grayson, a man whom I had believed to be a professional and respected member of the medical community, had been complicit in all this. His motives, cloaked in jealousy and bitterness, had led him down a dark path, one that had consumed not only his moral compass but also his humanity. Holmes, however, remained unmoved, his expression as calm and cold as ever. "Your actions, both of you, have gone beyond the realm of justice. Clara, your grief has twisted your mind, and Dr. Grayson, your jealousy has clouded your judgment. You've destroyed lives, including your own." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt the children. They were never supposed to suffer. But they are the only way I could make those men understand. They are the only way I could make them feel the pain I felt." Holmes's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "And yet you have hurt them, Clara. The children have been scared, but they have been spared. Unlike the men you sought to punish, what you've done for yourself, not for justice." Clara faltered for a moment, the knife wavering in her hand. I never wanted to hurt them. Only to make the doctors suffer, to make them understand what they took from me." "It's not too late," Holmes said gently. "You can still turn back. You can still end this now before more lives are ruined. Justice has been served, Clara. You can stop." For a long moment Clara stood frozen, the knife hanging limply in her grasp. Her eyes shifted from Holmes to the children, and then to Grayson, who had remained eerily silent throughout the exchange. Finally, with a choked sob, she dropped the knife to the ground, her hands trembling as she crumpled into Grayson's arms. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice broken. "But they took everything from me, my son, my family." Dr. Grayson's face, too, collapsed into a mask of regret, his eyes betraying the enormity of his guilt. "I never meant for it to end like this," he murmured, his voice hollow. "I just wanted to be recognized, to be seen as one of them." The sound of footsteps echoed down the chapel aisle, and Holmes turned to see Inspector Lestrade and his men entering, their expressions grim. They had surrounded the building as Holmes had planned, and now the time for action had come. "Take them into custody," Holmes said, his voice filled with an air of finality. Lestrade moved swiftly, his men securing both Clara and Dr. Grayson, leading them out of the chapel as Holmes and I turned to the children. "Are you all right?" I asked gently, my heart heavy with relief as I approached them. "We're fine," one of the older children replied, her voice shaky but grateful. "We're just scared, but we're safe now." I nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "You're safe now." As Lestrade led Clara and Grayson away, Holmes turned to me, his expression contemplative. We watched as the two criminals were taken from the chapel, their lives now irrevocably altered by the consequences of their actions. Back at Baker Street, as we sat in our familiar chairs by the fire, Holmes spoke quietly, his fingers steepled together in thought. "Watson, justice is not a thing of absolutes. It bends, it twists, and sometimes it breaks us all. Clara Wilkes sought to avenge the death of her son, but in doing so she lost herself. She became obsessed, consumed by grief and the need to make others feel her pain. And Dr. Grayson, too, lost himself in his jealousy, his desire for recognition. They were both victims in their own way, yet they caused so much harm." I nodded, my thoughts heavy. "It is a tragic story, Holmes, a story of what can happen when grief and injustice are left unchecked." Holmes remained silent for a moment before responding, his voice soft but certain. "Indeed, Watson, the road to vengeance is a treacherous one, and while Clara's actions were rooted in profound grief, they were also a stark reminder of how easily justice can be twisted into something far darker." We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the case hanging between us. It had been a long and difficult journey, but at least the children were safe, and the killers had been brought to justice. In the end, that was the only solace we could find. The trial of Clara Wilkes and Dr. Grayson was swift but unforgettable. The courtroom, packed with spectators, echoed with the weight of their crimes. Clara, her face gaunt from months of anguish, and Dr. Grayson, silent and cold, stood in the dock. Though their motives were rooted in grief and vengeance, they could not escape the consequences of their actions. The evidence, Holmes's deductions, the children's testimonies, and their confessions, was overwhelming. On December 12th, after a brief deliberation, the judge pronounced their sentence, life imprisonment. "Though your grief may have driven you, it is justice that you have failed to serve," he said. Clara crumpled, her body shaking with sobs, while Dr. Grayson remained unmoved, perhaps feeling the weight of his own remorse, or perhaps none at all. Though the public condemned their actions, there was an undeniable undercurrent of sympathy for Clara. The press painted her as a mother broken by the loss of her son, driven to madness by grief. While Londoners mourned the loss of the woman she might have been, they could not excuse her crimes. Holmes had predicted this reaction. The city's sorrow, Watson, is not just for her deeds, but for the life she lost. Her grief, when it takes root, becomes an obsession that can never be undone. Despite the tragedy of Clara's path, the children she had held captive were returned to their families, safe if scarred. Letters poured, each expressing profound gratitude for their safe return. One from a father read, "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You have returned our child and our hope." For Holmes, the case was closed, but for me it was a reminder that justice is not absolute. It bends, twists, and sometimes breaks us all. As I sat in the quiet of Baker Street, I reflected on Clara's journey. Her love, though twisted, was at its core a mother's love, a powerful force that, unchecked, could tear lives apart. Holmes's final words echoed in my mind. Justice, Watson, is not a thing of absolutes. Thank you for tuning in to Cafe Stories. If you enjoyed the intrigue and suspense, Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more captivating detective adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming and the mysteries alive.